Nishant Lalwani. So Nishant has been on a secret mission to try to build a global public interest media fund to defend newsrooms and the great work that many of you are doing out there. Nishant joins us here to give us an update of, well, first of all, where they're headed with this and what the plans are going forward. Nishant, over to you.
Thank you so much, Rashad and Alan and everyone else on the Splice team. It's very nice to see some familiar faces here. Even nicer to see some new ones. I really appreciate that. You'll also see my dog there in the background, sleeping on a Hainanese chicken rice pillow. It's got good taste in more ways than one. If the doorbell rings, my dogs will go nuts. So apologies in advance. It's a feature, not a bug, but it might happen at some point. So it's a pleasure to be talking to you about the International Fund for Public Interest Media today. It's an idea that we've been working on for about 1.5 years now, including with Alan's help and some others on this call as well. I'm going to present some slides and take you through the concept. I won't be very long in doing that because I'd love to make this a discussion where you can kind of raise whatever you'd like, give me feedback on how to improve the idea, and also signal if you'd like to be involved in some way. So, is that working? Can someone tell me if it is?
Yep, that's perfect.
Great.
Thank
Sorry,
you.
I can't see you anymore. Right, so I'll take you through a few slides, but I'll start by just explaining why we think we need a fund like this. So, as you all know all too well, independent media around the world is facing a really, really tough time right now. And even before the pandemic, Reuters estimated in the 4-year period between 2017 and 2021, there'd be about a $23 billion loss to global news media and advertising revenue. They're thinking that'll roughly double with the pandemic. So that's $40 billion just leaving the industry in terms of revenue support. Greg Sullivan has called this a media extinction event, and many others believe that's true. I don't need to tell you that this has huge consequences for democracy and development. There's a much greater chance of election interference, of corruption, of us failing to meet some important development goals. And also, as democratic spaces empty, undemocratic actors fill them, right? There's a huge Chinese influence in the African media scene. There's a huge Russian influence in the American and British media and electoral scenes as well. If you look at the amount of development funding currently going to media, and by development funding, I largely mean overseas development aid, for foreign aid from the likes of USAID or CEDA in Sweden or the Department for International Development, now part of the Foreign Office in the UK. Of course, many of those countries have put aside up to 0.7% of their GDP to go towards aid. For example, the UK has done that. And it's only, on average, 0.3% of that 0.7 that goes towards media development. That's a very, very, very tiny amount. And yet, more and more governments and civil society organizations are realizing how important media is. Perhaps they've taken it for granted in the past, that there'll always be a thriving media in the countries in which they work. But now with the likes of Cambridge Analytica, Facebook, and media dying out in many countries, media that's been around for a while, without business models to support journalism, I think many state actors are beginning to realize the impact it's going to have on the stability of their countries. There currently isn't an international vehicle to channel ODA funding towards grants and media development. Of course, the Media Development Investment Fund, perhaps on this call, do channel ODA funding into for-profit investing. They also do some grant work, which is really important in places like Myanmar and South Africa. But there isn't an international fund that can take large volumes of capital and deploy it primarily as grants. And there is now widespread building support for a fund like this. We've been socializing the idea for the last year and a half. We've been developing what it should look like. We've recently published a 40,000-word feasibility study, which I purposely didn't trouble you with before this call, but it's available online on the Luminate site or the BBC Media Action site if you'd like to have a look. And we've started thinking about what it would mean to create an international fund, like the Global Fund for TB, malaria, and AIDS, or even the Global Alliance for Vaccinations, but instead to support public interest media. So what would be the goal of a fund like this? Primarily there in the center, the goal is to increase the amount of resources going to media. Money is not the only problem in media, far from it. But what we've seen in the many countries in which we do grant making and investing in the media space is that it's often a binding constraint. In many places, media organizations, the binding constraint to them growing or even surviving is just having capital. And if you can have capital to pay your journalists, to pay your business development directors and so on, then you can begin to experiment with new business models, with membership models, with new forms of journalism. But if you don't have the capital to survive, then there's no way you can even do that. So this fund is not meant to take money from the traditional sources for media. I mean, the philanthropists like us or the Open Society Foundation, which already invest in media. It's really meant to open up new avenues for organizations and donors to invest and give money towards the media. And we think that a vehicle like this will help do that because, well, first of all, it's politically difficult and expensive to support the media in many countries, especially if you're kind of a Western donor. So you need a structure that can be arm's length, right? So if the Swedish government decides to support the media or the Norwegian government, then if they're supporting media in West Africa, let's say, that there's no possibility that they could be seen to be interfering with the electoral systems of those countries, right? So the governance structure of this thing needs to allow for an arm's length relationship, no political influence over what media gets support. It also should reduce transaction costs. So many donors find it difficult to figure out what kinds of media organizations to support. Media is highly politically localized. You have to be very, very sensitive to who you're supporting and what impact that will have, how representative that media organization is, how editorially independent it is. That can only be really determined at a regional or a country level. We'll also have a unit which looks at research around what works. And that's important because we're all experimenting with new business models, with new engagement models, and having a center attached to a fund like this that focuses on amplifying what works, sharing it, replicating it, scaling it up will be critical and will lead, we hope, to maximizing impact. How do you define public interest media? I mean, we could spend weeks on that and we still wouldn't agree, but really what we're thinking of is ethical, credible, non-partisan media working in the interests of all people across society as a collective media ecosystem. So really this is about investigative journalism, it's about news media covering issues of import around politics, society, commerce in a country. We've had a lot of people help us develop this idea. Special thanks to Alan and to Pat's colleague, Mohammed, who've been involved, as well as many others. As you'll see, we've got people from the research world, like Ethan Zuckerman and Rasmus Kahn-Klein-Nielsen. We've got, and Ying Chan, of course, who's both, academically orientated as well as a journalist herself. Maria Ressa and Delia Olajede, both incredible journalists working today, are on there, as well as some press freedom organizations like Reporters Without Borders, the UN system as well, UNESCO, and UNDP have been involved in helping us develop this. We've also sought some help from others. We commissioned PricewaterhouseCoopers, who built other global funds, to help us think about governance. We've been engaging some ex-heads of state who are very interested in this idea, in particular John Kufuor, the president of Ghana, in 2001, 2009. He's very, very interested in seeing how something like this could help develop the media in Ghana and in Africa overall. So where would the funding for this fund come from? We're very, very ambitious with what we want to raise for this fund. Right now, 0.3% of ODA means about $500 million per annum are going into media worldwide. But there's many countries that spend more than 0.3%. So the Swedish government spends 1.4%. If others were to get up, not even to that level, but to about 1% of ODA, we'd see a huge increase. We'd see an extra $1 billion going into media around the world. Now remember, the Reuters numbers, we're estimating that $40 billion will be lost. So although $1 billion seems like a big number, especially in my fundraising conversations, it's actually relatively small compared to the damage that's being done to media right now due to market conditions. We feel that we need to raise about $100 million in order to test the idea. Below that, it may not be worth creating the bureaucracy and putting the people in place to test the idea. So we're talking primarily to government donors, but we're also open to conversations with the big tech providers, Facebook, Google, Twitter, etc. We've had some hint that they may be interested in providing upfront endowments. And then, of course, we're always open to kind of funds from foundations and philanthropists. There's more and more people, I think, high net worth individuals and others who are understanding how mis and disinformation is affecting their lives and the lives of their compatriots. If you look at the impact of COVID mis and disinformation, for example, we're literally talking about life and death. And so I think, again, the importance of the media is becoming more apparent to certain philanthropists. We believe that the fund would essentially cover a few different types of media organizations, investigative journalism, cross-border or within a country, media support, providing intermediaries that might provide support to develop media organizations and news outlets. And then I think the largest amount of funding would go to regional bases that would support national level media. So these would be supporting newspapers, magazines, online sites within countries. I'll spend a little bit of time on governance because I think it's really important to ensure the legitimacy of this fund and the credibility of it. If you look in orange at the top, we've got reasonably complex, but I think important governance structure there. So there's an executive board, which would be the board that the executive director reports to. The head of integrity would ensure that media standards are being met during the grant making strategy, would also report to. And that is an executive board comprised of kind of the great and the good. I'll go into that in a minute. Separately, you have a board liaison committee with donors on it. So the donors don't actually sit on the board, but they have input, but they don't sit on the board, which means they're not really able to control what the fund invests in. There's an advisory council as well, which I'll show you how that's made up, but that really comprises a large range of people who are providing expertise and ensuring that the governance is representative. You've got here in grey regional and national programs, and we're imagining starting with regional offices in 4 or 5 regions. Importantly, each of these regions will have a lot of autonomy over what who they grant to. So the decisions for the portfolios and the pipeline decisions will be made at this level, at the regional level, not at the board level or even the executive director level. And that's because it's really, as I was saying earlier, it's really important to be politically sensitive, to be sensitive to local context, and for each of these offices to be run by people from those regions. In terms of the board, we hope that we'll have a number of people from the journalistic and media communities to represent an understanding of the interests of how those organizations need support. It might be one person from a donor or development agency, but in a very small minority. We need 2 members of the academic and research community to ensure that we're learning, ensure that we're both generating and using best practice. A chair and also an expert in financial or fund management. The advisory council, which is 16 people, will have a number of donors, the UN system, GFMD, which is an organization of an umbrella organization of media organizations, and interestingly, we'll have 4 members, we think, from different governments that the fund is designed to benefit, and so that can't be gamed, or favor will not be shown to particular countries. 4 members will be invited from different governments on the RSF Freedom of the Press Index, top performing government from each of the regions to make that up. So my last slide here, in terms of next steps, we're in very early stages at the moment of doing this, and we're hoping to essentially drive this forward in a couple of phases. The first will be a fundraising phase where we are looking for setup costs. We're trying to raise about $1.5 million. We've raised about half of that already, and we're trying to raise the other half. And that money will be used to hire an executive director, will be used to hire maybe 1 or 2 other staff members, some legal costs to set up the institution that the fund will eventually be housed in, and also provide critically runway for the kind of real fundraising to happen. And that real fundraising, where, as I said earlier, we're looking for about 100 million to test the idea over the coming 2 to 3 years. There'll then be a second phase, which we hope will start in late 2021. I wrote the slide before COVID, but we still hope that we can raise some of that money by next year. And then the grant deployment will likely start the year after, in 2022. We're also very actively looking for a founding executive director at the moment. And Russell Reynolds, which is a recruitment firm, are leading that search for us. We're looking for someone in particular who has experience in the countries that this fund hopes to benefit. We're looking for someone who can be a kind of voracious fundraiser. That'll be a critical competency to succeed in this role. Not necessarily someone who's an ex-journalist, although that would be wonderful. Someone who can understand how to run an organization and kind of a global fund like this, I think is the top tier of the competencies we need. This is a founding executive director position, so it'll run for 2 years, and that person then will be eligible to apply for the kind of permanent position, and will be advantaged in doing so. So if you're at all interested, if you have any ideas, then let me know, and Russell Reynolds can kind of be in touch either with you or your recommendations about that. So that's it in terms of the presentation. As I said, I tried to keep it fairly short. What I'd love to do now is get feedback from you on the idea. Would love to have comments or feedback, recommendations on people or donors, or just questions, so we can start a conversation.
I'm happy to start with the first question. So Nishant, you've been on this campaign for about a year now, I guess, and you've had multiple conversations with governments. What is the one response they've given in terms of the theory of change here, which is more money is needed to support journalism? What is the feedback that you've received? Do they agree with the theory here?
Yeah, so I mean, conversations with, for example, the British and Swedish governments, who already give some money to media, right? Either for media freedom or, in CEDA's case, for media development as well. Certainly, we've had feedback that this is an important initiative, and that they understand why media development is important. I think one of the things we've had to spend a little time on is how funding media has an impact, a positive impact on media freedom and on reducing misinformation. That's not obvious, right? And so taking those one by one, on media freedom, what we've seen is if there are just 1 or 2 voices dissenting in a particular country, let's take the Philippines, Rappler is one of the very few voices that is dissenting, then it becomes much more straightforward for Duterte to try and silence that one voice and focus an administration's effort on that one voice. Luminate invested in Rappler back in 2015 when it was starting, and the first thing that the Duterte administration did was to track the funding sources. And the SEC in the Philippines immediately identified our investment in Rappler as illegal. It wasn't, the SEC granted us the right to make that investment, but they followed the money, right? Of course, Maria refuses to be silenced, but certainly is under a lot of pressure. And the thing is, if you were to have 5 to 7 Rapplers in the Philippines, funding to support that, then silencing one may not, be effective. Launching many cases against one, and doing it against all of those voices then becomes a much more overt statement. It's not about exceptionalism. So that link between investing in grant making to media and media plurality and media freedom is very strong. But a lot of governments at the moment are concerned with media freedom and thinking about it in a more traditional way of protecting individual journalists, which is really, really important. But it's that's a baseline to start from, rather than a way of increasing media plurality. The other kind of link which we've had to spend some time on is the link to mis and disinformation, right? And again, the link there, of course, is that the more credible media outlets you have in a particular country, or fact-checking organizations, the more debunking there is, the more kind of trusted relationships there are with media organizations, between media organizations and individuals. Of course, that only holds true so far as the head of state in a particular country is not actively undermining the media, or there isn't a lot of money going into mis and disinformation. So that's a looser link, but still one we feel is theoretically important to note.
Thanks, Nishant. I just wanted to call on our friend Mariam Chaudhry, who runs the Current in Lahore.
Hi. So my question is that when you're working in a country that has heavy censorship and which gets more difficult day by day, and I read on your website that you guys are funding that, organizations that vocally speak out against censorship. I've forgotten exactly what it said. I've posted in the questions. If you just give me a second. Uncovers the truth and holds power to account and fund a press that is vibrant and free. When you're working in a country with such heavy censorship, that it's actually quite hard to be vibrant and free and hold power to account. And I personally believe it's better to kind of lie low and wait for the right time. So, but that would kind of go against what you're funding, or does it not go against what you're funding? Like, what's the vision on that?
Yeah, thank you, Mariam. It's a great question, and thanks for the work that you're doing. So, in terms of Luminate strategy is different from the proposed strategy from the International Fund, and it's important to make that clear. Now, I'll talk a bit about both. So, Luminate strategy, we spend about $20 million a year on media around the world, which isn't very much, but our source of funding is the Amidyar family. Pierre Amidyar is the founder of eBay, and he gives away quite a lot of money every year, but media spend is about that. So we've had to focus our media spend on 20 countries, and there's 5 in Latin America, 4 in Africa, a number in Asia, a number in Europe. And really, we have decided to focus our strategy on countries where there isn't heavy censorship. Because as a foreign funder, particularly one funded by a progressive billionaire, it's very, very hard to change the censorship landscape with a small amount of money and time and effort. And also, there's a huge risk that governments will react badly to foreign billionaires spending money. It's the Soros effect, right? Not to say we don't think it's really, really important, but we've decided to spend money where we think we can move the needle most. Now, the International Fund should cover many, many more countries. We hope it will cover many more countries. And we hope that with representation from the UN system, from government donors, and from other sources, that there'll be a legitimacy which is hard to reject. Think of the relationship that the Pakistani government has with the UN, for example. Like, it's not ideal, but it's also hard to reject, the UN outright as an institution. I'm not saying we're trying to build the UN, but this is a multilateral institution that will have backing from a wide range of actors, which is very, very different from a billionaire trying to give money. And so what we hope is that through the international fund, there'll be more money, but it'll also have that legitimacy as well. And then on your question, I think it's very smart and possibly a new way of being effective.
We're losing you a little bit, Nishant.
We lost audio for a bit there.
Yep. Oh,
I see.
Yep.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah. I think
Absolutely.
your bandwidth just kind of dipped a little bit.
Okay, sorry about that. So on your question, Mariam, about laying low, I think it's incredibly important and perhaps the only safe and realistic thing to do to lay low. And that and that's why again we hope that the international fund will have regional strategies or country strategies that are quite specific, because it's very different even from India next door. The way you're able to fund media in Pakistan. So yeah, that's one of the reasons why we want a fund like this, is because hopefully it'll mean that more support will get to places like Pakistan, which don't have support they need right now.
Vipal has a good question, which I think I understand the point of the question, but I think it's better to hear from Vipal himself. So why don't you unmute yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Alan. Hi, Nishant. Thanks for the great presentation. So yeah, my question is really around the areas you touched on in terms of what the fund would be supporting, but I think there's a key aspect of it, and maybe it is covered in the feasibility report, which is kind of the rise of technology and its impact on media, and how obviously the big platforms and the big tech platforms that have come up have kind of skewed the revenues and the advertising revenues that used to support the media. And so how would the fund actually support some of those market asymmetries in terms of the big tech platforms and kind of supporting more public interest media platforms? And do you see the fund to have a role to play in that?
Thanks, Vipul. That's a great question. So I guess there's two aspects to this, right? The first aspect is the underlying causes of the decline in revenue for media. And then the second is the impact in the short and medium term on the media landscape and democracy itself. This fund is really designed to address the latter of those, right? So when making these presentations, I often get a lot of questions like, why don't we tax the tech platforms? We need new policy at a state level to like the French tax credits for media, or the Canadian subsidies for media. I think all of those are really interesting ideas that should be explored. They're largely policy ideas. Some of them may also be kind of regulatory ideas. And we are very interested in that. In fact, we've been, through our subsidiary Reset at Luminate, we've been actively working on lobbying the European Commission and others to regulate the tech platforms. However, in the short to mid run, we also have to note that there's a huge impact of media organizations dying out, of journalists being out of work, of power not being held to account. And that's why I was saying that money is not the only answer. In fact, it's not the long-term answer. It can't be the long-term answer to this. But in the short to mid-term, over the next 10 years, we need to make sure that we don't have irrevocable damage to democracies and the societies in which we live. That's why we're trying to raise money for that period. Now, during that period, we will need to come up with regulation and with innovation that means we can have sustainable business models for journalism, and obviously the ultimate reason for that is to ensure that the viability of journalism, but also to ensure the editorial independence of journalism. Another huge problem with philanthropy is that you have basically rich, powerful people giving money to the media and other causes, and we never interfere with editorial strategy. MDIF will never do that, but ultimately, there's going to be a point of expansion where you get people who are less scrupulous, and it becomes really, really hard to have a dependency on the media. On those philanthropists or investors. And so really what we need is, this is kind of a Band-Aid, if I'm honest. It's a Band-Aid which allows media to experiment and get through this period, and come up with basically a reinvention of what media should be and how it should be supported. And hopefully during the same time, there will be regulatory and policy innovations that mean that the structural market conditions for media change. This fund isn't really about that.
Yep. Thanks, Nishant. Sandeep, go ahead and ask your question, please.
Oh, I think he was just about to reach for his camera.
Yeah, thanks, Nishant. That was a great discussion so far. I just had a question around the nature of the governance arrangements and when a media outlet qualifies as large enough to warrant funding from the fund, given that in certain, or like the most expensive part of setting up a media organization would be the initial phase of getting it set up. How does the fund look to what is credible or established before it considers that criteria for funding? Is it more that the fund looks to a place that's already established by journalists, or is it something that they look towards spreading out the fund's investments in terms of seeding organizations to get started?
Yeah, thanks, Sandeep. So first of all, I should say the fund doesn't exist yet. So many of the investment policy decisions are TBD. However, I can speak from my experience. I'm sure Pat can speak from hers too, in terms of funding early stage media outlets. So I'm going to disagree with you, actually. I don't think starting a media outlet is the most expensive stage in the process. I do think it's the most risky and can be the most difficult to get funding for. But if a media outlet is successful, it'll take a lot more money to kind of grow than it does to set up. And I think it's important to point that out, because actually to help start new media outlets, it doesn't take that much capital, which means you can do it with relatively small amounts of money. So, Luminate, with its relatively small budget, does that quite a lot. In Latin America, for example, we funded a report called the Inflection Point Report a few years ago. And we found that most digital media outlets were starting with about $10,000 of capital. Now that's very, very low. It should probably be 4 or 5 times that at least, to give it a little bit of runway. But that gives you an idea of the relatively low barriers to entry that exist at the moment in the information space. But your question is important, because there, basically, as far as I understand it, it's how do you determine something is ethical, credible, non-partisan when it doesn't exist yet? And that's something which is really important for us to think about. Now, the way we do that at Luminate is, we primarily look at the journalistic history of the team that are involved. And we look at their editorial vision, whether what they're hoping to do sort of meets those standards in practice, how their process runs, and so on. But also, frankly, it's a question of reviewing that. So if you give a relatively small amount of money to an organization, they can begin publishing. And then certainly we do, and the International Fund will do editorial reviews. And that's not done by us. As I said, we don't take a position on that. But there are consultants and outsiders who can provide third-party opinions. And they will pair, usually, the coverage of that particular outlet to the outlets in the same country over a 2-week period. And we'll look for bias, we'll look for what news is being covered, and so on. And we've run those in markets like Myanmar, Nigeria, Brazil, places where there's a good number of media outlets, there's plenty of bias in those countries as well. So you can then normalize for kind of what's considered to be non-partisan in each of those countries. And so, we may go on track record at the early stage, but then we'll review quite often to ensure that that organization is still considered public interest over time.
Nishant, I had a quick question, if I may. I was wondering, Are there different support models for journalism that the fund has planned for, apart from money? For example, legal assistance.
Yeah, so that's a great question, and often we get a lot of feedback that often non-financial support is as valuable, if not more valuable, than financial support, and it's certainly something I believe as well. That's where we had that kind of space for media support, either through intermediaries or through other sources. I think that's going to be an incredibly important part of the way this operates. And hopefully with a fund that's, with the economies of scale of a central fund like this, I hope that you'll be able to have providers and consultants or lawyers that can actually work across many portfolio organizations. So its short answer is yes.
So Nishant, I liked what you said earlier about this being, so I've got two questions related to that. So you said earlier that this was meant to be a Band-Aid or a bridge to get to, wherever we're meant to go. Can you elaborate a little bit on that? Firstly, if I'm understanding you right, you're saying that this is a Band-Aid so that the industry has a bit of time to transform itself into a more viable, industry. And if that's the case, then why not just call this a transformation fund and support the transformation of the business, or to help support the emergence of 100 or 200, 300 niche startups that could take this forward. So that's one. But and also, when you say this is meant to be a bridge, what does that final state look like? Are we ever going to get to a point where we'd be comfortable with that?
Yeah, thanks. So on your first question, this fund will support innovation and it will support startups. So that's something that's just really important. So that transformation, I really like that. I'm going to steal that language. Stands better than Band-Aid. So the transformation will hopefully happen. I will say though that, as I said to Sandeep, that first of all, you can't really rush the transformation. You just have to experiment. You can set up incubators as we have. You can set up, startup programs as we have. But those need to be tested. They need to be developed. Some of them need to fail. Some of them need to grow. And that takes time. And then your second question, which is, what does the future look like for media? I mean, if I could tell you that, then we wouldn't need to do any of this, right? I wish I could tell you that. And we could all get out of the miserable state that we're in and just go straight to point B. But unfortunately, I can't do that. What I can do is tell you about where we're seeing green shoots. So Nabila's work at The Correspondent for us is one of the major green shoots, which is membership models in journalism. And she can talk about that much more eloquently than I could. But fundamentally, we see that as a movement from the value proposition being away from third parties, i.e. advertisers or platforms, and back towards the audience. So the same people who are benefiting from journalism are paying for it. And that is philosophically and ethically, I think, as important as it is financially. Because then the people who are paying for the product are able to direct it. And you're able to meet their needs and not the needs of advertisers, i.e. clickbait. Another thing we really love about The Correspondent is that the way we see it, they're selling not just content, but they're selling a relationship with the journalists, with the team. And that's a very fundamentally different way of approaching journalism. And I imagine it makes a lot of journalists uncomfortable. Journalists who are used to sort of being behind closed doors and sitting in a dark room late at night, writing stories and then putting it out into the world. And suddenly, if you have to talk to your readers, if you have to respond to them, if you have to take their advice, that's a different job description from just writing content and putting it out into the world. And so that is a fundamentally different product you're selling from content. But Nabila, I really don't want to speak on your behalf, even though I do want to sing your praises. So if you have anything to add on the green shoots, then please do.
Nabila, jump in.
Oh gosh, what can I say? I mean, prior to coming to The Correspondent a year ago and consigning myself to a life of cycling in a flat land, I was working at The Guardian, I was at the Reuters Institute, analysing, media online, and this is the first time that I've really been answerable to the people who funded our journalism. And I'm thinking every day about the principles of what we're doing and the values. So that includes, not privacy being paramount. So not relying on any data collection, or not knowing any names, really focusing on the quality of ideas. And I think the biggest challenge for the journalists is the fact that they are very transparent about where they're coming from. They explain their bias, and they are on a journey as they're reporting. And we're hoping to get more members. We currently, I think, have 55,000 members in 130 plus countries. And we really rely on this sort of two-way relationship, that we're writing a story, but hopefully their input is helping us, move on to the next beat. That's challenging. I mean, it's very exciting having writers who are currently they're in Egypt, India, Nigeria, US, and Greece. Those are our permanent correspondents. But of course, the members tend to come from one particular place. So because we crowdfunded in the US, and because we were born out of a Dutch sister organization, I would say that our members, even though we are all over the world, they skew from one certain place. And so I think our writers I think my role as the conversation editor is to keep working with them to try to get even more voices on the platform, and to get their journalism to a place where it is, not talking down or being patronizing, but including every voice. So my gosh, we're a year in, coming up to our 1 year anniversary, and I just see so much potential for what we could be achieving. But I feel like it's not even a dip in the ocean yet. So there's my idealistic spiel. I hope that worked.
I'm a proud member, and always love getting your emails. Thank you for what you do.
And vice versa.
Interesting. I mean, you guys are talking about not just one kind of transformation, right, Nishant and Nabila? You're saying that our jobs are, journalists' jobs are transforming. We've never spoken to our audiences before. In fact, we've never really known who was reading or watching or listening before. We didn't care. You put it out there, and somebody would pick it up, and that was that, and you went home. I think in the session before you, Nishant, we had Sunny Shwe from Frontier, of course, and they've been through this massive transformation, and we were kind of proud to be a part of that. We've seen journalists in the organization go from, hey, I don't deal with all this newsletter salesy stuff, to knowing exactly what their open rates are, knowing exactly what their lifetime customer value was, and knowing how to respond to a survey from focus groups of readership. And from this, I sort of wanted to ask, and again, this is open to Nishant, Nabila, Pat Bird, if you like, Miosen, whoever. But I wanted to ask what the end game was for this fund. Where would you say, that this person has now transcended funding? They've achieved what we wanted them to achieve. They've become what we wanted. We kicked this off. We gave them funding. They've grown through a process. Is it resilience of some sort? Is it sustainability? Is the idea of being able to speak to various audiences, sell journalistic products, and earn yourself a living? Where does this go? Where would you say, all right, our work is done?
I think it's for the International Fund, it's when we have financial models for editorial independence, right? So models that allow journalists to do the work they think is most important, while not relying on funding with vested interests. And of course, that has a lot of elements within it, because there's membership models, there's other models, many other models. I know event models and subscription models and cooperative models being tried out. So there's many variations of that, but also within each of those models, there's the question of under which circumstances does this model work. So the correspondent in the Netherlands, or the correspondent, the Dutch edition, I should say, worked very well in the Netherlands, because the Netherlands is a relatively rich country. You can have, a very literate country. You can have a large proportion of people reading it with only a small proportion of people paying for it. And that can support a newsroom of a decent number of journalists. Now, does that work in Uruguay? Does it work in Venezuela or in Kenya? What are the factors that drive? Some of it's about willingness to pay, some of it's about market size, some of it's about the diversity within a country, of language and of other things. And so for us to feel out and flesh out what are the parameters under which business models work that allow for that editorial independence, for me, getting to a stage where we're able to deliver public interest media to most people in the world and understand how, that's the goal.
Great. And on that note, I just want to wrap this up. But before I do that, just wanted to call out two very wonderful comments that I think are worth thinking about. Vipul wrote, journalism has to evolve, and it's interesting how much of SPICE beta has focused on relationships and memberships, which is absolutely true. That's what we believe in. Pat Bird also wrote something really insightful. Never, ever in the history of journalism have we had the tools available to listen and engage with our audiences. And that is absolutely spot on as well. All right. Well, thank you, Nishant. That's been really, really wonderful, really insightful. Thank you for all the knowledge there. We're going to be back in 2 hours. We have a session with GIJN and Bridget Gallagher of the Gallagher Group to talk about how to raise funds in time of COVID. So we're back in 2 hours. We're going to go comb our hair and have a shower or something.
We're going to have the resources from this session, including the chat box and Nishant's video, in splicebeta.com/resources at some point. And you'll get the newsletter with the video in it as well. So at some point. So thank you so much. This was wonderful.
Thank you so much for having me. And
Thank
nice to see you, everyone. Bye.
Bye, everybody.